Hi folks, welcome to the August episode of Export Exchange, US Dex video series designed to keep you up to speed on global dairy markets. I'm Al Levitt, and I'll be joined shortly by my colleague William Laux. Today we want to do a review of US export performance in the first 6 months of 2020. And now that we have half a year's worth of trade data, let's break down our key products and also look at what markets drove our growth in one of the most challenging periods ever for global trade. Let's start with our overall performance. In the first half, U.S. exports were up 14% by volume and 13% by value. And you can see on the chart here, our gains primarily came from skim milk powder and whey products. S&P exports were up 25% or more than 80,000 tons, and whey products were up 14%, more than 30,000 tons. Lactose was also part of the increase, up 7%. And a few products that trade at smaller overall volumes did well too. Milk protein concentrate exports were up 33%, and whole milk powder exports, not shown on this chart, were up 34%. But on the other hand, with a slowdown in global trade from widespread food service closures, U.S. cheese exports were flat in the first half of 2020. And butterfat volumes were very small, dropping 15%. So taking a closer look at skim milk powder, U.S. S&P exports topped 400,000 tons in the first half of the year, a record pace, and as I said, it was up 25% from last year. More than 3/4 of our powder sales go to Mexico and Southeast Asia, the two markets on the left side of this chart. But fortunes have been very different for our two main customer markets this year. U.S. exports to Southeast Asia were up 64% in the first half of 2020. That's an increase of 67,000 tons, or 11,000 tons a month compared with a year ago. We've seen very strong buying across the region. The main growth has come from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia, and Vietnam has been an active buyer too. Some of this growth has been due to the absence of cheap EU intervention powder that came on the market early last year, so buyers have turned to the United States instead. Some of the growth also is due to favorable U.S. pricing, and some is due to active buying this year by blenders and recombiners in the region who look to buy ahead and stock up to be able to carry a larger cushion of inventory in these uncertain times. Now, in contrast, U.S. exports to Mexico have slumped. Until this year, Mexico was our largest powder market, but we've shipped 26,000 tons less in the first half of this year than we did last year. We've seen the severe crash of the Mexican peso, and other recessionary pressures have really been a drag on Mexican purchasing power this year. Meanwhile, we've won new customers in some of our other markets. S&P exports to the Middle East North Africa region were up more than fivefold in the first half of the year. It's an increase of nearly 16,000 tons, and our volume is the most since 2014. The main buyer here has been Egypt. In China, our sales have more than tripled, a gain of almost 6,000 tons. June alone was the most in more than 3 years. Our exports to Japan have more than doubled and continue to move at a record pace. And lastly, not called out specifically on this chart, our powder exports to Colombia were up 68% in the first half, and our sales to New Zealand nearly tripled. So that's skim milk powder, a very strong first half in a period when U.S. suppliers met buyers' needs and increased share of global trade. But what about some of our other key products? William, why don't you fill us in on those?
Thanks, Al. Let's keep it moving through the other major products in the dairy complex: whey and cheese. On the whey side, U.S. exports have increased by 14%, or 32,000 metric tons, just in the first 6 months of the year. After non-fat dry milk and skim milk powder, whey is the dairy product category where U.S. exports have grown the most in the first half of 2020. You can see here on the graph who the major driver of that growth has been, and that's been China. U.S. exports to China have grown by 64% in the first half of the year. There are a couple factors for that I want to touch on here a second. Number one was the completion of the Phase 1 trade deal between the U.S. and China. That agreement ended the tariff disputes between the two countries, which enables the U.S. to compete on an equal playing field again. On top of that, factor number two is the rapid expansion of China's swine herd. Their herd was significantly reduced last year by African swine fever, and now the disease is much more under control with increased biosecurity measures, which is enabling the country to add more pigs quickly. And as the world's largest pig-producing country, any expansion in their pig herd will drive up whey demand for feed. And that there is still a final factor, and that's as part of the Phase 1 agreement, China allowed the use of permeate in food applications. While this is a widely used practice in other markets, it is a welcome development which will further enable growth of the whey sector in China. Now, all of this put together is increasing demand out of the country, and that's been a driving factor for US and world whey exports in the first half of 2020, and that should continue. And with that increased demand out of China, particularly for sweet whey and whey permeate, that's going to be price supportive in the second half. The bigger question mark comes on the higher protein side, where a large percentage goes into sports and nutrition applications. But with gyms closed or at reduced capacity in many countries, how government restrictions evolve will be a key factor to watch. But let's turn to the final dairy product of the day, cheese. Now, cheese has been at the center of so much of the volatility in prices this year. We discussed how food service closures disrupted demand for cheese, especially in the United States, on a prior export exchange. And although cheese demand has slowed down this year, we've seen demand internationally actually be fairly resilient overall. We saw that exports were pretty flat through the first half, but we saw strong growth to Mexico, and that came a lot in the first quarter. Additionally, the last 2 months of data that we have for US exports in May and June saw substantial growth. June even broke the record for most cheese exported in a month from the US. And several other markets besides Mexico helped supply that growth, so it's been really global. Why this matters is that the international market accounted for a record percentage of US production of cheese in June. That played into the very tight cheese market that we saw in late May, June, and July here in the US, and helps explain the high prices that persisted until recently. So, let's recap and identify the factors to watch moving forward. US skim milk powder remains highly competitive on the world market, as Al touched on, and that should translate into greater exports. The key factor to watch in skim milk powder is where overall demand is in the large markets Al talked about. On whey, we've seen strong demand growth driven by China. Whether that continues at this pace will be a major determinant of market direction for whey permeate and sweet whey. Whey proteins, on the other hand, will be heavily impacted by COVID-19 measures and whether people feel comfortable exercising indoors with others around again. Finally, on cheese, it's all about food service. How much are people eating at restaurants? That will play a major role in cheese markets around the world. Now, that's it for USDEX Export Exchange. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you next month. Thanks, everyone.